Hello guys, my name is Amit and welcome to this channel. In this video, we'll try talking about what do you mean by provider. The provider is an important factor which has to be considered when you are using Vagrant. Before I talk about the provider, let me first tell you how does this virtualization work in a nutshell. So what happens here is when you are going for, let's say, a physical machine, say for example, I have got this physical machine hardware component layer. I say this is the hardware component layer or simply like a hardware. To use this hardware, we install something like an operating system on top of it. Say for example, this is my operating system, whichever it is. It could be Windows, it could be Linux, or it could be Mac, whatever that you are using on your host directly. So this is generally called as the host operating system. So host operating system. Say for example, I'm using Mac right now. So Mac is my host operating system here. This is my macOS precisely. Now this macOS is important for me at this point because I want to use my hardware. To use the hardware, the operating system brings something called as the device driver. So this is the collection of device drivers, which is generally known as a hardware abstraction layer. So this is my hardware abstraction layer, which is kind of implemented inside the operating system, and because of this I could use my hardware without knowing the details of them. Now if I want to install multiple operating systems on this machine, instead of installing them natively, I could install one more component on top of this, which is known as the hypervisor, and this is what we are calling here as a provider. So this is something called as a hypervisor. Generally, when you say hypervisor comes in two flavors. There is something called as type 1 hypervisor and another one is something called as type 2 hypervisor. In case of Vagrant, we are using a type 2 hypervisor. More on that, I'll provide one more video where we just go and dive into the type 1 and type 2, their differences, and which one should I use in which scenario. At this moment, remember, we are using type 2 hypervisor. This is also called as hosted hypervisor. Examples of this hosted hypervisor could be VMware, or something called as the VirtualBox, or something like QEMU or libvirt, and there are many others. All of them are the examples of type 2 hypervisors. Type 2 hypervisors require operating system to be installed on your machine. Without that, you can't use this hypervisor, and that's another reason why it is called as hosted hypervisor. It is hosted on top of one of the host operating systems. Now this hypervisor will provide you the bunch of virtualized hardware components. So precisely, if I look at the picture here, you are going to get all the physical hardware components. Let's say I'm having a CPU here, or let's say RAM here, NIC here, audio driver here, or audio card here. All of them will get virtualized into virtual hardware components. So maybe I can say this is the virtual hardware. This virtual hardware layer is added, or it is emulated by using something called as hypervisor. Maybe in short, let's say there is a CPU here, which is like the hardware CPU I'm talking about. This can be virtualized into something called as vCPU, virtual CPU. So this CPU is not a hardware. This is implemented as a logic, you can say a program, which is done by using that hypervisor here. So this is the one which is going to provide the simulation of my physical CPU. So that creation of physical to virtual is done by the hypervisor. And on top of it, we are going to create our virtual machines. Say for example, this is my virtual machine that I'm creating here. Now as you can see, this virtual machine is going to have its own hardware. So let me put it here. This is going to have not the physical but the virtual hardware. On top of that, you are going to need one of the operating systems to work. So you are going to install the operating systems on top of it. Let's say an example, this is the Linux. The one which you install in a virtual machine is known as a guest operating system. You saw earlier there was a host operating system installed directly on your physical machine, you can call it as, and there's one which is installed in the virtual machine known as the guest operating system. Now on top of this, you are going to install all the required libraries, or you can say frameworks, or your applications, and so on and so forth, whatever that you want that virtual machine to use for. This is called as the virtual machine. So this is generally known as type 2 virtualization. In type 2 virtualization, you are having the physical hardware, operating system, hypervisor of type 2, which is going to provide you the virtual hardware components, which you are going to use in terms of that virtual machine. That virtual machine creation and management will be done by the hypervisor. So in short, the hypervisor is going to manage the virtual machine. Now, if I'm doing it myself, let's say I'm taking an example of VMware. So I have to use the VMware in order to create the virtual machine. I have to do every single thing by hand. But because I'm taking a lot of efforts to do this, and it is kind of wastage of my time because I have to keep on repeating this multiple times, I'm saying use a tool like Vagrant and get this job done in matters of minutes. Okay, so if that is the case, let's understand what exactly the provider here in Vagrant's context. So the provider here is nothing but that hypervisor. So hypervisor in case of Vagrant is known as the provider. While Vagrant ships out of the box support for the VirtualBox, Hyper-V, Docker, Vagrant has ability to manage other types of machines as well. So it by default supports a VirtualBox, but it need not to be VirtualBox. For example, for demonstration, I'll be using VMware. On my machine, Mac machine, precisely ARM64 Open Silicon, the hypervisor is not still giving me the right output. So I'm using VMware at this moment. So VMware or VirtualBox or Hyper-V, Docker, there are multiple options available which Vagrant's by default support now. This is done by using the other providers with the Vagrant. So that's what we are talking about. Alternative providers can offer the different features that make more sense in your use case. Whether you want to do it with VirtualBox or whether you want to do it with VMware, it depends on your requirement. It depends on your environment. It depends on your operating system. It depends on your CPU architecture as well. So which one that you want to use, you decide, and then you start using the Vagrant. Before you can use another provider, you must install it. That is, installation of other providers is done via the Vagrant plugin system, which is what we are going to see in the next session. So at this moment, if I try looking at this big picture here, you are using Vagrant to create the virtual machine. But as I explained in the last session, in the last video, Vagrant itself doesn't do anything. Vagrant talks to the let's say hypervisor, or we call this as a provider in terms of the Vagrant here. So it talks to the required provider or a bunch of providers depending on your requirement. I'll say provider at the moment. So this is the provider that we are using, and this provider will actually create or manage a virtual machine. So this is my virtual machine. So virtual machine will be created by a provider, but what to create, how to create, what to install, all of this configurations will be provided by Vagrant. So that's where the Vagrant comes in, and that's where Vagrant requires provider. This communication, Vagrant to provider, will be done via something called as the plugin. Think about plugins as extensions, which is what we are going to see in the next session. Okay, so in this session, we talked about what do you mean by virtualization and how you generally take care of it manually. But with the help of something like the providers, Vagrant can do the job, again, making your life a little bit simpler. In the next session, we'll talk about the plugins. Thank you very much for watching this video.